Hello, my name is Di Crisp, and you have tuned in to the Wine Growing for Winemakers session. And the first person who is going to talk is Patty Skinkis. Patty is the statewide viticultural extension specialist. She is a core member of the Oregon State Wine Research Institute, and she runs a lab in the Department of Horticulture at Oregon State University. Her research focuses on vine physiology, vine balance, and management that influences wine quality. She is very engaged in on-farm trials and does research trials in people's vineyards. She produces research that is impactful and extremely useful to the industry. She also, in her extension capacity, does all kinds of workshops, including workshops in Spanish, that help people identify issues in vineyards, whether they be trunk disease or fungal pathogens or insects like phylloxera, and has done some really innovative and cool workshops to help people understand what is going on out there. And she is she also teaches at Oregon State University, teaches viticulture. And she has numerous awards, best viticulture paper with ASEV, and is the president of ASEV. She also has tremendous respect for her peers. She does a lot of work where she is the principal investigator or the co-principal investigator on many research projects. She's respected by her peers and incredibly valued and respected by the Oregon wine industry. So with that, Patty.
Thank you for this opportunity to present on winemaking for winemakers, and thank you to Di for that really nice introduction. In the next hour, I hope to share with you some of the decision making that goes on in the vineyard and basing it along with what goes on in the vineyard and having the vines really tell us what's going on and looking at the phenology. So the goal of vineyard management, and especially for wine production, is to ensure that we have the quality fruit and the amount of fruit that we want for desired production goals. Now that's pretty wide. And because I know that I'm going to be speaking to winemakers from many different production scales, this is really something to keep in mind, that the goal of vineyard management is really to ensure those two things: quality fruit and the amount of that fruit for whatever your goal is to produce. And there's a lot that goes into those 9 words that I had on the prior screen. There's seasonal parameters, there's multi-year parameters, there's location, there's climate, but really what we're going to focus on is what we can try to manage in the vineyard, and specifically focusing on the fruit today. Now, there's a lot of different aspects of the whole vine and the vineyard ecology, but really we're going to focus on this to be able to tackle this in the 1 hour that we have. So there's the quantity and the quality. So the quantity is the number of clusters we have on a vine, and the cluster size. We don't have a lot of control on the cluster size. Most of the control is with our cluster number. We can alter that with our pruning practices, with our shoot thinning, and of course with the cluster thinning. So we'll talk about that a little bit today. And then there's the quality. So there's, first and foremost, we want to have good quality fruit, so meaning no diseases, no insect pests damaging those. And of course, we want to try to influence improved composition of those parameters in the fruit that would lead to good wine quality. But I have the word physical properties here as well, because if we don't have good physical properties of the cluster itself, it can lead to poor composition. So fruit cracking, damage due to a sunburn, that could be a result of things we do in the vineyard. And one of the most important things to keep in mind when we manage for wine quality is phenology. Everything has its place and time, and the grapevines will tell us where we need to be. So all of our operations really must adhere to the growth stages of the vine. And the vine doesn't care what's going on in politics. It doesn't care what's going on in a pandemic, which many of us learned in 2020. So we have to keep going. We can't just mothball vineyards. We need to make sure that we're doing timely operations. So the timing is important, but not only the timing, there's also the sequence. So we have to do things in the proper order. I have two screen captures here of a famous grapevine phenology key, and this happens to be the BBCH method that I use. This is also the one that I put in our pest management guide. I like this one over the typical Eichhorn and Lorenz stages because this one has a lot more stages of granularity. So you can look at it and say, okay, we're at 10% flowering or 20% flowering and have a different number to this. Now you can spend a lot of time putting numbers to your growth phases, but the most important thing is to remember we want to know date and timing of bud break. And we can look at that from the beginning, the midpoint, and the end. Bloom, which is when the flowers start to have their caps fall off. Of course, we want to know beginning, middle, and end of those, that time frame. And then, of course, when veraison begins. So the beginning, middle, and end, and of course, harvest. So those are the key stages that we want to know about for different operations. We'll talk about which ones of those today. I do have listed in here spray programs. That would be any insecticides or pesticides that need to be sprayed on to ensure that we have good quality fruit, no disease. Those adhere to the same phenology key. Canopy management also has its time that it needs to be conducted for best output or the best impact on the fruit. Of course, fertilization, so any fertilizers that are applied, and irrigation. Now today, most of my focus is going to be on canopy management because those are the things that we can adjust and typically are altering for the sake of fruit quality alone. But this is what the growing season looks like at a glance. There's a lot going on here. This is kind of my one figure showcase of what we do in a season and some of the decision making. This is actually published every year in our pest management guide. So what we have here is at the bottom, the phenology stages. So the growth stages of the vine and what needs to be done, whether it's for weeds, controlling weeds, diseases, insects and mites, when to sample for viruses, which is becoming an increasingly problematic issue. And then cultural methods, which is where I'm going to focus most of my efforts today, because this is where most of what we believe we're doing to the canopies is impacting the end fruit quality. So there's timing to shoot thinning, cluster thinning, leaf removal, those sorts of things. So a big challenge that we have is not only is there a lot to do in a given season, but vines are perennials, meaning they come back every year. They have a memory. What you did to them 10 years ago will impact them today. Of course, the more recent growing season is going to be more impactful on what's going to happen this year. So management is critical from one year to the next. And there's a core concept that relates to the perennial nature of the grapevine, and that is vine balance. You've probably heard this mentioned before, and a lot of times people will talk about wine balance and then vine balance. Vine balance is a completely different thing from wine balance. It has to do with how the plant is responding physiologically to its environment. And that could be the soil, the water, what was done to it the prior year, the training system that's used. So we're going to talk about what vine balance is, how we use this concept, how it's measured, and how it can be managed. So this is the best way I can explain what vine balance is. We also call it crop load. And crop load of a vine is really linked to or similar to vehicle payload. So the truck on the left is a bigger truck. It can handle more wood. The car on the right was not meant to carry wood at all, or certainly not that amount. And you can tell the one on the left is working fine. The one on the right is not doing so great. And this is exactly what happens in looking at vine balance. We want to balance the amount of canopy growth to the amount of fruit that's on the vine. So that's really the balance we're talking about here, the two different components. One is considered a source or providing carbohydrates, nutrition to the fruit, and then the fruit itself. Now, we like to think that we have ultimate control as viticulturists or winemakers. We think that we have ultimate control over a vineyard, but we really do not. Some of this vine balance is really dictated by your rootstock and your cultivar that you are growing. So some cultivars are just known to be really productive, meaning they have really high fruit levels, meaning they're going to have this balance tipped with the grapes being heavier than the leaf area. And then there's some that tend to have more vegetative growth than the amount of fruit. So some of it is not within our control. Now, a point of clarification here, yield does not equal crop load. Now, this is a challenging concept because in most of horticulture, the field I work in that's larger than just viticulture, yield is equal or synonymous with crop load. But in viticulture, we always like to make things a little bit more picky or discerning, and our yield is actually not the same thing as crop load. Crop load is taking into consideration both a weight of the canopy size and the fruit weight. And that's with good reason. It actually helps us understand how we might be able to adjust how the vine is growing or how much fruit is on. Now we can measure crop load in different ways, and there's different components. So we can look at pruning weights, which we can measure this time of year when we're getting our pruning done. There's leaf area to yield ratios, which no person in their right mind in practice in a commercial vineyard or vinery will measure this. This is something academics measure in research trials. The crop load index is something that's easily calculated, and it doesn't have any units because it's weight. It's weight of your yield divided by pruning weight. So what factors influence vine balance? Well, pretty much everything you do in a vineyard. So how you plant the vines in terms of spacing, your training system, the pruning that you do, those are three components of kind of that vineyard design and implementation. Then there's the factors that we have less control over, at least in Western Oregon: soil type, nutrition, so fertilizers, also the water, whether you have precipitation or irrigation. Certainly if you're in a more arid region, you can much easier control your nutrition and your water. And of course, pests and other damage can also wreak havoc with the vine balance. So anything that would really damage carbohydrate movement or cankers, for example, and trunk disease may influence vegetative growth and thus reproductive growth. So one thing I want to mention with vine balance too is when we do have damage caused by some other of these factors, or not even necessarily damage, but influences, it will automatically change vine balance. It will not necessarily grow a crazy canopy or a ton of fruit. It will be automatically muting or enhancing how much vegetative or reproductive growth there is. So we can measure vine balance, and there's different metrics that have been suggested for optimum vigor of grapevines. And really with vine balance, we're trying to get to a balance of not having too much vigor so that we can not have so much management we have to do to ensure quality fruit. Now, I'm not going to list all of these off. These are here for reference, and certainly they're in some handouts that will be provided. But basically, these are all measures of essentially the canopy. So the leaf layer, the cane weight, which is during dormancy, shoot length. The crop load index is the only one here that actually shows fruit. So in Oregon, I put in a notation that cane weights are usually going to be between 40 and 60 grams. And most of the time when we're looking at assessing vigor and balance, we're looking at pruning weight and the crop load index, which is the yield divided by pruning weight. So the first thing that we measure to get at vine balance is pruning weights. So this is perfect. If you have the ability to go out and prune yet after this symposium and grab some pruning weights, this is an excellent thing to do. I know some people are aware of it and rarely do it, but it's one of the best measures we can do as viticulturists. And so you prune the vines and you weigh the 1-year-old wood from reference vines. And so on the left are high vigor vines, on the right are low vigor vines. Usually you can tell the difference in your vineyard if you have high or low vigor, but when you start to really assess it on a numerical level, you can oftentimes identify a problem much earlier than your eyes will in terms of how the vines are dealing with a certain treatment in a vineyard. For example, if you try a new cultivation technique, or you do a different fertilizer regime or a watering regime, having these data is really helpful. So you collect these data from certain reference vines that you come back to every year. The second thing you measure is your vine yield. Now, many of you would be saying, we get vine yields at the crush pad every year. Well, this is not exactly the same data we need. Vine balance data really requires the same yield data that you would pair with your pruning weights. So you go and harvest reference vines individually or in panels and weigh them, record this with your in your data sets, and then compare that with your pruning weights and any other data you would want to look at. So this is really critical. This is also helpful to get this information for your crop estimation. So when you have your pruning weight and your yield data, this is when we have our crop load index. So you yield and you divide that by your pruning weight. So oftentimes we're using the yield from a given season. So 2020 yield would be divided by pruning weight collected in winter of 2020, 2021. So this past harvest, that yield would be compared to pruning weights you're getting right now. And we do have ways to interpret this number. Any numbers higher than 10 are considered out of balance. So too much vegetative vigor too little vegetative vigor and too much fruit. If you get into the moderate vigor level, 3 to 6, that's considered a good balance. If we have really low numbers, that means you have really high amount of canopy and too little fruit. That's one component of it. So that's using both yield and pruning weight. We can also look at our dormant cane weights and get an idea of whether we're on target for vigor. So here's some cane weights shown here. You can calculate those from your pruning weights per vine, and that's by using your shoot count prior to pruning weights. And we can get a real good idea of how vigorous our vines are. I have arid regions listed here in this table, but also Western Oregon, because we tend to be super vigorous. So it's not uncommon to have cane weights that are 80 to 100 grams. And then with that pruning weight data, we can come up with an idea of how we want to prune. So you can actually say, well, we really need to put more buds out, or we need to leave fewer buds out. So the lower values indicate a weak or sparse canopy. Higher values indicate overly vigorous vines. So don't worry about jotting all of this down as you listen, kind of conceptualize what I'm saying here, because I'll have 3 handouts available to you as part of this session. And there's just screen captures of it here. One is on how to measure dormant pruning weights, one is on understanding vine balance, and one is on the role of canopy management in vine balance. But we're not done yet. We'll talk about a little bit more how to use these dormant pruning weights. So pruning weight data is used to achieve balance. I mentioned this a little bit before. Unbalanced vines are really not sustainable. We have a really high canopy management costs in high vigor situations, and we often can have decreased fruit quality in those situations. Too high of potassium, sometimes this wreaks havoc with our pH and our TAs. Also, there can be a decrease in yield with with too much vine vigor. In some cases, we can have completely vigorous vines and have a healthy yield, no problem. So it really depends on the situation. On the flip side, if we have very low vigor vines, like the picture shown here, we can have just overall lack of ripening. So we will inherently influence fruit quality and there will be very low yields. We've seen these situations, like the picture shown there is actually trunk disease wreaking havoc on a vine. So we have really low yields, really the inability for that canopy to support even small amounts of fruit. But in terms of how we use some of this pruning weight data, we can use this to guide our pruning practices, which is really more complicated in some regards than some people may believe. High vigor vines, we need to leave more buds per vine. In low vigor vines, we want to leave less. Now this seems counterintuitive because oftentimes we think a low vigor vine, we want to leave more buds out so that we can ensure that we have something that grows. But in reality, what we need to do is allow that vine to push out fewer buds and put more reserves, whether it's from their roots or their trunk, into those fewer buds that are growing so that the growth of those buds will be better. Now, with high vigor vines, if we leave too few buds, we actually run into issues with over vigor and oftentimes can lead to situations with inflorescence necrosis. So we don't want to have too few buds on a high vigor vine because we want to be able to expend that extra reserve of carbohydrates and nutrients across more growing points. And if we have an overly vigorous vineyard that we just cannot add more buds to because we only have so much space from one vine to the next and we cane prune, which is very often the case, we long term you might need to adjust vine and row spacing or adjust your training system. Some people have left out kicker canes to leave more buds up to a certain point in the growing season. That helps to spread some of that extra energy out across more buds as you start the growing season. But vine balance doesn't just start when we start working with a given growing season. We have to sometimes take a step back and look at what are we doing in our vineyards, especially when establishing new vineyards, to help match training system to vine capacity. That's really when our vine balance work really needs to begin. So vineyard design decisions come into play. And so now as Oregonians, we've been growing grapes for 40 to 50 years. We've now have some regional information that can help guide this. In the early days, we didn't know how we should design vineyards to match this. And really what we should be doing now that we have more years of experience is designing vineyards that better match what our soils can do, what our climate can do. So we have to think about our vine density. So what is our vine and row spacing? And what is the training system we're going to use? Those combined will influence how we manage the vineyard in a given growing season. So we might have overly vigorous or under vigorous vines because of these early decisions in vineyard design. It's not so easy to fix these missteps in vineyard design, so we're left with dealing with those with our annual management practices, whether it's shoot thinning, shoot positioning, hedging, and leaf removal. So here's an example of a high density VSP vineyard in the Willamette Valley. There's a lot of growth. This is before they've hedged. So very low crop load as in this vineyard because they have really high amount of canopy growth, small amount of fruit. They actually had fruit set issues in this vineyard because it was so shaded and had to hedge multiple times a year just to keep the canopy small enough and get enough sunlight in to allow adequate growth and ripening of that fruit. But it was not to the benefit of the fruit itself. And eventually we would have to make larger changes. In terms of in these regions, like a lot of the Willamette Valley, we have to compare our vine spacing with our training system. When we compare, how we match those up, those are our first steps. We really have to manage the rest that we really can't control. We can't control how much rainfall we get or our water holding capacity of our soils. So we end up having really a luxury environment when it comes to a grapevine. They grow tons. They grow their primary shoots and laterals and tertiary shoots. They're just growing like crazy. So we have to spend a lot of time on canopy management, even with some of our tweaks in vine spacing and training system and rootstock selection. So when we do our best to match the rootstock with the cultivar, with the vine spacing, the cultivation procedures, then we will hopefully have less of these corrective measures to do. Now on the flip side, in arid regions, vine canopy management is going to look a little bit different, or vine balance management is going to look different. So you have vine spacing and training system decisions, but in this case, we will have to do most of our canopy management as water and nutrient management, not so much the hands-on shoot thinning, shoot positioning, hedging, leaf removal, etc. So less canopy management is going to be needed here. So back to our high vigor situation. Can we fix overly vigorous vines? The answer is yes. But there's two ways of looking at this. There's the short term, which is canopy management that we have to do in a current season to ensure that we get good sunlight exposure, good coverage of our sprays, and to get good development of our fruit. So we have to do shoot thinning and suckering, hedging, and leaf removal, and all of them have to be done at appropriate time. The long term, there's multiple approaches by which we can change a vine balance. Of course, when you have a vineyard that's planted, it's hard to remove vines or change the spacing. So you'd have to look at, can we change the fertility program? So are we putting in fewer fertilizers? Can we change how much moisture is available in our soils? In the case of Western Oregon or in the Willamette Valley, we're at the mercy of precipitation. So we have to look at maybe there's different vineyard floor practices, different cover crops that can be used. And also there's a possibility of consider training system change. So here's an example of a vineyard in the Willamette Valley on a more vineyard floors, a valley floor site that would be thought to be super vigorous. But this vineyard is in like perfect balance, and we can see it in the canopies. It was hedged once, but probably didn't even have to be hedged. It's got moderate vigor due to years of competitive grass alleys that you can see here in the middle, and it's been dry farmed. So this vineyard has really come into balance. Also, it helps that it's a wider spacing. I believe it's a 5x8. So now we're going to jump into these corrective measures in terms of what needs to be done when in the vineyard. Some of these aren't looked at exactly as corrective measures in a bad way, but things that we have to manage or we will just get out of control with respect to how much sunlight's getting into the canopy and the competitive growth of different shoots. So the first is shoot thinning. This is really a necessity, and it's more of a necessity, of course, and possibly more times need to be done in really vigorous vineyards. But basically, this is removing multiple shoots that come from a individual node. Oftentimes you'll get 2 or even 3 shoots growing out per node. So those extra shoots need to be removed. So this must be done at a critical time, early spring, before the shoots are 6 inches in length. Really, we want to decrease shoot density so that you don't have a major mess of shoot growth that are causing shading or getting intertwined or blocking either sunlight or spray coverage. And typically we are targeting a density of between 3 and 6 shoots per foot. This also influences yield, but in a good way. Most of the time we're looking at not having maximized yield, but having a yield that is suitable for both economics, but what the winery needs. So we don't necessarily need to have every shoot that will pop out in spring grow. So it will influence yield, but if we have 1 shoot per node, that is ideal. The next thing that happens during the growing season is hedging. Now, this is a necessity in vigorous vines, especially those that are high density or have close vine spacings. So I use this vineyard as an example because it's rather narrow in terms of the vine row spacing and the height of the canopy. And so oftentimes we're hedging our VSP canopies both on the top and the sides. Otherwise, these canopies would grow right together. Obviously, this needs to be done for sunlight exposure, but also to get tractors and workers through the field, also for spray coverage when we're applying those fungicides. The most important thing I think I can say for Western Oregon is that when you're doing your hedging, you really should do it before you do your sprays with the fungicides to help get the spray coverage you want on the tissues that you are going to keep. Probably the most ridiculous thing somebody could do is get a spray on because they see that it needs to get on, and then they go in and hedge a day later or a day or 2 later because you've just cut off some of your efficacy of that fungicide spray coverage. So it's important to keep that in mind. Keep your tasks of canopy management and disease control intertwined because they really go hand in hand. In this case, one point I want to make is that your hedge height must not exceed the row width. This vineyard, the hedge height somewhat does exceed the row width, and there can be more shading in the cluster zone, especially during early morning and then later in the day. And so that could potentially influence, especially in high density or very close spaced vineyards, could reduce the amount of available sunlight you have on your canopy throughout the day, which can be really important as we get into our later season and the ability for those vines to ripen fruit, I should say. Now, I do want to tackle one myth, and this seems to come up a lot, that people want to hold off hedging as late as possible. And certainly it is true that if you cut a shoot tip off of a plant, lateral shoots will begin to grow. That's certainly true. However, it is not what is the single cause of lateral growth. We find that in high vigor vineyards, we'll have laterals growing even before we have hedging occur in the vineyard. So I wouldn't prevent that hedging from happening just because you want to prevent laterals. If it needs to be hedged, you can see it. It's growing together. You need to get out there and hedge those vines. So hedging is not going to be the sole cause of having more laterals grow. So next, I want to talk about leaf removal. So I should back up a little bit. Hedging can happen when it needs to, but oftentimes in Oregon, Western Oregon, it has to happen around bloom or shortly thereafter. And that typically has not caused concern over the impact on fruit set or flowering and fruit set. So next in line is leaf removal. So this is a list of some of our best management practices for leaf removal in Oregon. It's very common in recent years to shy away from leaf removal, which is unfortunate because it's one of the best tools we have for quality management in our climate, and especially for Pinot Noir. So this is removing leaves in the cluster zone only. So everything I talk about on this topic is on cluster zone only. Typically, morning sun side of the canopy is removed. Anywhere between 50 and 100% of those leaves can be removed. The best is if this is done obviously in really high vigor vines or high density canopies to expose that fruit. This can be done as early as bloom and as late as fruit set for the optimum time window. So if you're nervous about bloom, that's okay. You can go in at fruit set and do your leaf removal. Bloom time leaf removal became the focus of some of our earlier work on leaf removal to see if we could control yield as well as fruit disease control. And we found that we actually improved the amount of anthocyanins in fruit with our earliest bloom time leaf removal. Pea size to bunch closure is the latest you want to start leaf removal. And we absolutely are adamant about not starting your leaf removal at veraison. So you can do more leaf removal later in the season if you started earlier, but do not start doing your leaf removal at veraison or later. That will lead to sunburn. So I did a number of years of research on leaf removal. It's actually talked about in brief during another session during the symposium, but I want to showcase a little bit of it here as to how we came up with some of these best management practices. What we found was for Oregon Pinot Noir, the earlier we did leaf removal, the better, although any leaf removal before bunch closure was ideal for helping control disease. We found that 100% of cluster zone leaf removal led to higher anthocyanin and wine color intensity. We did not find sunburn even in warm years. So an example is this picture here. 2018 was one of our warm, dry years. We had done 100% leaf removal in the cluster zone at bloom, and this fruit looks beautiful. And this was on at harvest in 2018 that we took this picture. We've also found increased aroma compounds with more leaf removal. And while it could potentially lead to a significant decline in bloom and fruit set, if we did a lot of leaf removal, we found that doing our 5 to 7 leaves being removed in the cluster zone at bloom had very minimal impacts on fruit set. In fact, when we did the quantification, it was 20% reduction in fruit set, but at the end of the day, it didn't really, or end of year, I should say, really did not influence the yields. So the yield was not drastically impacted. What we found is we had fewer berries per cluster, which could also be a benefit for increased color, exposure to those berries, and also disease control. And it is one of the most important tools for disease prevention, especially in organic and biodynamic vineyards, where we don't have as many fungicide tools in our toolbox to control powdery mildew and botrytis. So it's really important to do leaf removal early in those situations. Okay, so we've went pretty quickly through most of the growing season up to this point of looking at yield management. So this is where I know a lot of winemakers are most interested in the vineyard at the later part of the season when we're starting to do crop estimation, seeing what we have out there hanging in the vineyard, and also looking at how we want to adjust that crop to meet target yields. So there's a lot of different factors that influence yield. Now, I mentioned early on that our challenge in vineyards is that they are perennials. They have a memory. What we have done to them last year will influence them this year. And so we see that playing out with the amount of fruit that we have. So yield is actually formed over 2 growing seasons. Last growing season, the floral primordia was being developed inside the bud. And so what we're coming into 2021 with was actually dictated by what was set starting out in summer of 2020. So we come into the growing season, the primordia develops, it grows out as this young shoot, and you can actually see the inflorescences here, 2 per shoot. Actually, this one has 3. Oftentimes for Pinot Noir, we have between 1.5 and 3 number of clusters per shoot, or I should say 1 and 3. The average fruitfulness of Pinot Noir, based on many years of research here in the Willamette Valley, is about 1.8. So that's our total amount of clusters on average per shoot. Then we get into bloom, and we certainly know that bloom time conditions can lead to good or poor fruit set. Typically what we see in terms of years where we've had very low yields and very high yields seem to be dictated by, in part, how much the weather has, or how nice the weather has been at bloom time. So I think a lot of us were experiencing this firsthand in 2020 with conditions around bloom not being ideal and leading to some poor fruit set and thus very low yields. And certainly what happens on later season during veraison to harvest can influence fruit quality as well and yield. So there's a lot going on in that 2-year cycle. The environment, the physiology, and disease conditions of the prior year, as well as all of these factors in the current year. So those things aside, I want to focus on crop estimation and cluster thinning specifically, because these are practices that we do in the vineyard that oftentimes have a lot of decision making that has to occur. And crop estimation is an estimate. It's when we're determining how much yield is hanging out there on the vines. We do this pre-harvest. The goal is very practical. We want to be able to prepare for wine production, but also we want to know how much we have to adjust for harvest. And most of the time there's a set target yield for a given vineyard or block that a winemaker would like to see, or a vineyard manager would like to see out of a given block. And then that information on crop estimation will inform the cluster thinning practices. So how much we have to adjust crop level to achieve those target yields. Most of the time, these target yields are determined ahead of time. They're based on contracts, and oftentimes we believe that that yield is linked to a given quality parameter that we want in the fruit. So how are lag phase estimates done? Well, it takes a lot of manual labor at this point. That's the best methods we have. There's some research going on about finding methods that are much more hands-off and more based on remote sensing, or I should say proximal sensing. However, at the moment that we're going to talk about the crop estimation methods that are commonly used in industry. So a yield for a given block is determined by looking at the number of bearing vines, the number of clusters per vine, and getting a leg cluster weight and applying an increase factor. So it's going out, counting clusters and weighing clusters. Now, to come up with the increase factor, it really requires that you have a data set created for your vineyard based on your harvest cluster weight and your leg cluster weight. And I know the majority of vineyards don't have a site-specific increase factor because it takes a lot of time. And by the time you get to harvest, you're just in harvest mode. You're not worrying about getting cluster weight data. However, I'm here to just explain that you can get this data if you would like to be able to come up with site-specific or vineyard block-specific increase factors for your cluster weight. So basically, a lot of the yield estimation has to do with how much that cluster is increasing in size from lag to harvest. And why we focus on the lag phase period is because it's a point in time where the cluster is not changing as quickly as earlier in the growing season, which is really critical because you can't get through with all of your yield estimation data collection very quickly. It just is time consuming, especially if you have many vineyard blocks. So the typical lag phase yield estimation method has been going on here in Oregon for decades now. So this Oregon Pinot Noir method, which was developed by Steve Price, used mid-lag as the time point for coming up with increase factors. So They defined mid-leg as 55 days post-bloom, and they correlated this to 75% hard seed tips. And there was no specific timing mentioned for when bloom. Was it the beginning of the bloom, end of bloom, midpoint of bloom? But they used the increase factor of between 1.8 to 2. And this is logical because at the leg phase, the clusters are about half the size, or I should say berries are about half the size that they will be at harvest. So the increase factor here is applied to clusters. The sampling in this method requires that 4% of the vineyard is sampled, but in variable blocks might be as much as 30%, which sounds a little crazy because that's, 30% of your fruit gone. And the cluster samples should be 200 to 400 clusters. So recognizing that some of this didn't necessarily make sense, or we needed some additional information to know whether we were doing a good job with our yield estimation with this method, we tested this at over a 6-year study. And so we recognize that a lot of people focus so much on crop estimation, but we really didn't have good data on when leg occurred. We didn't know how long it lasted. It's not a visual timing that we can really see in the vineyard. We can see bloom and we can see veraison, but it's not really easy to see when the clusters are at leg. So we really need to know leg, the timing of it, in order to use the appropriate increase factors. So we also had troubles with sampling. So a lot of times there's insufficient sample size, there's a lack of random sampling, there's not the accounting for missing or bare vines or weak vines, and then also just getting a representative cluster size, because cluster size is highly variable. So during the 6-year period, we looked at Pinot Noir during the entire growing season and took cluster weights and monitored cluster weights, counts, berry size throughout the entire growing season for 6 years. And we actually did this in 2020 as well. I didn't show the 2020 data here, but basically we keep trying to come up with a berry development curve to identify when leg phase occurred. And we found it. Now, it's not a perfect textbook double sigmoidal curve, which is what we expect when you have real things growing, biological organisms growing in a field. They aren't going to have the perfect textbook double sigmoidal curve, but we found the leg phase. And this, I'll have you note, is the berry weight. And that's what really leg phase is quantifying. It's saying it's when the berry is in leg phase, not the entire cluster, because the entire cluster is a whole bunch of berries. So the leg phase we found, and we found that on average, the start was around 49 days. Now, I should point out that we did this counting based on post 50% bloom, so the midpoint of bloom. We found that the middle of leg phase was at 55 days, and most of the time, leg phase was done by day 60 or day 61. There was more variability at the start, but the finish was almost always around 60 days. The duration was on average 12 days, but it could range between 6 and 24 days based on the year. And we found that it agreed very well with thermal time, so meaning heat units. It was about 1,000 heat units after the midpoint of bloom when we reached the start of leg, or at mid-leg, I should say. So these were really encouraging to see such reproducibility across variable growing seasons. The vine had its sequence. It had a certain stage at which it grew, but we didn't mark it based on a calendar date. We based it on a phenological stage. So at midpoint of bloom to these time points was when we reached a leg. And what we found in all of this data set is that we can focus on leg, but we can actually be more flexible with this data set to identify how we might use increase factors that change based on the time since bloom. So we don't have to wait till 50 or 55 days to get our leg phase estimates, or I should say crop estimates, because they're no longer at leg if we push it earlier. But one thing I want to point out here is this is the increase factor, meaning how much the berry size is increasing, or as it grows to the end of the growing season. So we have a huge amount of rapid change in berry size from basically 30 days or less. So within the first month after bloom, those berries are growing extremely rapidly. So this is that growth rate and change. And as we get closer to the 40 and 50 day range, we see that it's starting to slow down. And that's what lag, this lag phase window here. But for the most part, this curve allowed us to take thermal time or day count and determine what are our increase factors. So we looked at increase factors from time of bloom or the midpoint of bloom, and we see that by using this curve, we have increase factor that changes quite rapidly. So at day 15, it's 10.9, but by the time we get to day 50, it's 1.9. But if even 5 days prior, at day 45, we're at 2.2. So having this increase curve was really helpful for growers to fine tune their increase factors. And I do have this curve available for use by anybody who inquires. We are working on getting this data published, but it basically gives you an idea of a benchmark or a ballpark that you can use to see if you're on track with your increase factors for your vineyards. So the big question is, how do we reach the most accurate estimates? Well, following good sampling procedures is probably the best thing you can do, and coming up with a good plan is important. Maintain records of both your lag cluster weights and your harvest cluster weights. The thing that people always have is lag weights, but they rarely have cluster weights at harvest. So getting those are really critical, because then you can develop your own increase factors by just taking your cluster weight at harvest and divided by your cluster weight at lag. Make sure you take good records too. When is bloom? Look at the start and the finish. And you can just say 50% is halfway point, or you can actually look at this percentage each day and determine that. Also, recognize that the greatest variability in a vineyard is the cluster size. Believe it or not, clusters are highly variable. And until you start measuring individual clusters, you won't recognize this. Now, when we get into years with very poor set, especially those where we have hens and chicks, it's really difficult to estimate crop. So 2020 and 2019 were very difficult years for crop estimation because of this. Because hens will develop relatively normal, but the chicks, the very small berries, will not develop normally. And also, cluster weight can change drastically from lag to harvest depending on climate conditions. They can either gain weight with late season rains, or they can desiccate and break, and those situations can make it very difficult to understand what your final harvest weight will be. And the most important thing is recognize that crop estimates are estimates, not actuals. So don't bank on them being a really tight margin of exactness. It doesn't mean that they're going to be completely off, but you have to have some reasonable wiggle room. Okay, so the last portion I want to talk about is the crop thinning. And the question is, yield or vine balance more important for fruit and wine quality? Well, we studied this over a number of years. Basically, I've been looking at this since 2011, so almost 10 years now, through various studies. And oftentimes yield and quality are the driving purpose of vineyard management in Oregon, which is no surprise. We're in a high-end wine producing region, and cluster thinning is one of our key parameters by which we believe is helping us ripen our crop earlier and leading to higher quality. Of course, nobody will deny that if we have really high crop levels, crop thinning will decrease disease, so botrytis. And certainly crop thinning will help you achieve target goals if you have a winery capacity. But we want to really get at what is helping us achieve the quality goal at the intersect of making sure we have a good amount of that fruit, so that recognizing that if we make a good thing, if we're unnecessarily cutting fruit off the vine, then we want to know how much we should stop doing that, or how much more we should to realize a price increase for our fruit, or a price increase in the wine, or shifting fruit to a higher quality level. Most vineyards are doing between 25 and 50% crop reduction through cluster thinning, and it costs anywhere from $700 to $800 an acre by having manual labor crews come through the vineyard and thin the crop. When I did a survey of the industry a number of years ago and asked what their crop thinning practices were, the majority said that they did it to improve quality. Very small amount said they did it to achieve vine balance. And of course, they didn't identify what the vine balance parameters were. And typically the crop thinning was done in Pinot Noir. The most commonly thinned variety was Pinot Noir, and typically there was a very small, narrow range at which they were thinned to 2 to 2.5 tons per acre. So we seem that we believe that thinning was in some case perhaps a little too much based on the canopy sizes that we have. We do recognize it is a cool region and we do come into fall rains, but we wanted to test this. Do we actually have hastening of ripening when we're doing crop thinning? And we started with timing and intensity trials. The timing trials were thought that if we have a problem with vine balance, then thinning earlier should improve the vine's balance and the fruit's quality. But we also tested intensity. We wanted to see, should we be doing it at really severe levels or should we leave a full crop? We also tested wings or no rings. And so this work was done both in the Willamette Valley and the Dundee Hills, as well as the Illinois Valley, both on Pinot Noir 115. And we did this over 3 growing seasons from 2011 to 2013. And what we found from doing this work is that when we had the full crop, the vines that were not crop thinned, we did not have overcropping stress. That was the number one concern. A lot of people thought if we don't crop thin, we'll have this overcropping stress, we'll have poor yields the next year. We did not find that. We actually found that leaving the crop on held back the vine vigor, and actually later thinning was ideal for reducing the amount of laterals and just toning down the amount of second crop that would form if we thinned too early. Also, there was a concern of severely delayed ripening, but we found that that wasn't the case. We rarely had an impact on the ripeness level. There's only one of the 3 years where we had to reduce crop significantly to improve Brix. And the benefit was that we have more yield that should be economically more promising. We also thought that there would be significantly lower fruit quality with our higher yield levels, but we found very few differences in fruit quality and wine sensory. So we found that increasing yield did not change how the vines grew the next spring, which indicate that we didn't have overcropping stress. It didn't affect canopy leaf area, so we didn't see a decline in the canopy growth if we left more fruit. We did not find a decline in pruning weight, nor a decrease in vine nutrient status. So the amount of fruit we had, even at the baseline, did not reduce the vine's capacity to perform, so to grow, to have the appropriate nutrient levels. So across these 3 years in these 2 vineyards, we questioned whether it was the canopy size or vine size or the fruit weight that influenced fruit composition more. So this was Brix, PHTA, total anthocyanins, phenolics, tannins, YANs, and basically nitrogen components. And we found that really yield influenced Brix and anthocyanins the most, but all of the other parameters were really dictating more so by the vine size, so how much canopy grew. And we found that by decreasing yield by 40% or more did not increase Brix any further. So if you did severe thinning, even in a high yield year, going much more than 40% crop thinning did not increase fruit parameters. So it did not require us to always get as low as 2.5 or 2 tons per acre to achieve the optimum yield or optimum quality. So here's an example of the impact on wine aroma compounds. This is the 2011 and 2012 wines from the Willamette Valley. We compared the control, which was full crop, and the thinned. We actually just put the different time points and the severities together and said it was either thinned or not, and compared these data, and we found that the control was not different from the thinned. And in 2011, we had pretty high yields. 7.3 tons was not any different from the 2.66 or the 4.33 tons per acre from an odor activity value for these different components. We did see that in 2012, the same was true. There was not much difference there. What we found was that that year we had much less of a yield. Our baseline yields were almost 4 tons. And by comparing to the thinned down to 1.2 or 2.3, not much difference. So we found that yield was really a secondary impact on quality. It was really the year and the vine vigor that was most important. And we found that timing of a crop thinning really didn't impact quality, which was a surprise to me. I thought we might have more of an impact. So we decided, well, we'll just leave it at lag phase when growers are already doing it. So that's the best management practice at this point because our vines are not overcropped. They're not being taxed by having the fruit that is on our vines. So if you want to crop thin later, might as well do it later and hold back some of that vigor, because when we crop thin too early, it led to herbaceous fruit, herbaceous wines, and it also led to more vigorous canopy growth, more laterals and more second crop. One of the things we found with this study was we were looking for this leaf area to crop weight curve. We actually did not find it. So here's a beautiful study that's published by Cleaver and DeKuzlian in 2005 that many people cite as the optimum leaf area to fruit yield ratio of 0.8 to 1.2. We did this. We had huge amounts of canopy leaf area to fruit, and we never had anything that looked anything like a curve. So our vines aren't overcropped. So we did that work at 2 vineyards, and we recognized that we needed more information. And we expanded this work to what's known as the Statewide Crop Load Project. A number of you have probably seen me present in the past about this project, and hopefully this will shed some light on the more recent years of the project. But basically, this work has really helped us to define what Pinot Noir crop level or crop load really looks like for the Willamette Valley. So we've had a number of producers in the project, those at really high-end wineries to those that are more on the production or value wines. We've had 25 companies participate in 5 counties and 6 AVAs. Between 10 and 15 vineyards join the study or are part of the study each year, meaning they have different crop levels being applied to their vineyard each year. And some of these vineyards have been in the project for 9 years now. So 5 of those vineyards have had the same crop levels applied to the same vines for the last 10 years or 9 years. Some of those vineyards in the list here could only join for about 3 years. Some have done more than 3 years. But basically, when they chose their crop levels, they applied them to the same rows and vines in the vineyard over repeated years. And so it was done in a randomized complete block design in each vineyard so we can compare results within vineyard, but then across all vineyards. And here are the yields. This is all yields, all vineyards in each year. And what we can see here is a chronology of our regional yields. We know that 2019 was a lower yield year, 2016 was, we know 2015 and 17 were very high yield years. One of the things to note here is that in each trial we had a full crop, meaning no thinning, or we had some 2 cluster pursuits. So very little thinning was going on. And the most we ever had with Pinot Noir for pounds per linear foot was around 1.5 pounds per linear foot. We rarely were reaching over 2. So that gives you an idea, if you calculate that out based on your linear foot of row in a vineyard, what type of tons per acre you would apply. Now, I don't show any tons per acre here because we work with so many vineyards with different spacing and different vine densities that it really has to be shown on a pounds per linear foot to share or have the same units. Our mean over the 8 years was 1 pound per linear foot or 1.6 kilograms per meter. So to give you an idea of how much thinning occurred, all of the thinning practices were typically done on a cluster per shoot basis. So 1-2-1-2, 1-1-1, or 1-0-1-0 in terms of how many clusters they had per shoot. And this is the percent of crop reduction at harvest compared to no thinning in these trials. So usually the 2 clusters per shoot had an 8% yield reduction. The 1.5 clusters per shoot, which is a 1-2-1-2, is a 22% crop reduction. 1 cluster per shoot, which was the standard industry practice for a long time, was a 42% reduction in yield. And very few collaborators use the half cluster per shoot, but that would be 64% reduction of yield. And what we hope to develop from this was a linear regression that would tell us how much crop thinning was needed to achieve the optimum quality of our fruit. So every year we would quantify the fruit from these vineyards with some of the basic parameters. So Brix PHTA, YAN, anthocyanin, phenolics, and tannins. We did measure some more different measures in the first 5 years because we used ETS labs, but in the last 5 years of the study, I took the work in-house, and so I do total anthocyanins, phenolics, and tannins. But the most important thing here to look at is the number of vineyards. So this is the total number of vineyards that had a difference with crop thinning if between their treatments, so in a given year. So we had 10 to 14 vineyards in any given year. 50 to 85% had at least one thing that was different with the fruit. It might have been TA, but nothing else. It might have been pH and nothing else. So crop thinning might have changed that, or there was some difference there. Between 15 and 45% of the sites had no fruit differences whatsoever in their crop thinning. So what we found was there was no consistent differences at a given vineyard or across vineyards for crop thinning. We did see that most commonly what was altered by crop thinning was total soluble solids, or BRICS, and anthocyanin. But you can see it's less than 50% of the vineyards in a given year. So anthocyanins is 25% of vineyards showing a difference in a given year by doing cluster thinning. So not a lot of overwhelming response of crop thinning in these vines. So when we pooled all the data together from the first 5 years and statistically analyzed it, we looked at regression relationships and said, well, what is the relationship of yield to pruning weight if we see which one of those is affecting the vine more? And we found that yield decreased pH. So as you increase yield, you decrease pH, you increase TA, you decrease anthocyanin and tannin. Those were what we'd expect. But pruning weight actually influenced tannin more and DN more and TA more. But all of these changes were not big. So when we look at the regression equation, I put some real numbers to it. It said for each pound per linear foot that we thin from the vines, we will increase our BRICS by 0.6. Now, we barely get a pound per linear foot, so we're not going to cut that much off of our fruit, of our vines. So if I convert this example into acres, we would say for each 2.7 tons that we drop on the ground, we will increase our BRICS by 0.6. When I shared this with the growers, they said, well, this is more thinning than we would ever achieve even in our vineyards. And this is exactly why we don't see the impact. We're cluster thinning, but we're not cluster thinning enough to really make a difference. So what this suggests to us is that we don't have an overcropping issue. Our Pinot Noir aren't overcropped in most situations. And here is our crop load to give you an idea. I said early on that 5 to 10 is the optimum. We didn't even reach 10. And for Oregon, we were saying 3 to 6, but that's a moving target. We're still trying to understand this. 2018 was our highest crop load year, and this was because we grew smaller canopies. We had a dry year. 2012 and 2016 were our lowest crop years, and we had a low crop load. So we see that we can shift these each year, but we don't have an idea of what is optimum. We're kind of at the mercy of our growing season in terms of what Mother Nature gives us in terms of how much canopy we grow and how much baseline fruit we have. But one thing I can tell you is we are able to see from this study the regional impact of our climate. So here's the pruning weights from all the vineyard sites from 2012 to 2019. We see a drastic drop in 2018. This was our dry year. Our vines responded accordingly, grew a smaller canopy, but we had a good amount of fruit. And so that's why we got a higher crop load. Less canopy, more fruit, but it was good fruit. And we see a rebound in 2019. And we definitely have the rebound back to normal by the time we get to 2020. So in terms of what the wine sensory said, we actually didn't do analytics on the wine. We thought we would do that if we saw something important to look at from the sensory standpoint. But what we found was that with expert winemaker panels, we could not find a difference by crop level, and there was no preferred crop level. The differences were most notable by site and the vintage year. When we took the in-house sensory from the winemakers that were part of the study, when they did a blind tasting, they had no clear preferences of their crop thinning practices. But once they revealed the crop level, they had identified preferences, which suggests that yield does have a psychological impact of perceiving better quality if you have lower yields. So the crop load research really gave us an idea of what our parameters or our bookends are, and that it's really the site and year that has the biggest impact in fruit and wine quality, rather than crop thinning itself. Most often Brix and anthocyanin were improved with crop thinning, but we did not have to get down to 2 tons per acre to get that improvement. We usually could get there with about a 8 to 20% reduction in crop thinning. So that's the 2 clusters per shoot or the 1.5. We didn't have to go down to 1 cluster per shoot. Crop level had no impact on wine sensory perception, and there's no clear link between yields and preference when we did a technical tasting. And vine balance has greater impact than yield. So looking at tons per acre is not always that helpful. So the biggest takeaway for us is the standard target yields will not ensure quality across all vineyards in a region. And it means that our job is harder. We have to start looking at what does a vineyard allow us to do? So we have to start managing from both the quality and the quantity aspect in vineyards. Achieving vine balance will ensure a more optimum quality, quantity, and overall vineyard and winery economics. We've seen that from our collaborators in the statewide crop load project, that they've increased their cost of goods sold, so they are decreased the cost of goods sold so that now they are making more profit. The pathway to optimum vine balance is not easy. It requires an in-depth knowledge of your vineyard, the climate, so keeping an eye on weather conditions and weather patterns, your plant materials, vineyard design and management steps. And after now almost an hour, you're probably feeling a bit overwhelmed by all of this if you're not a vineyard manager. And the best thing I can say is work together and build trust with your vineyard management team. As a winemaker, certainly you've got your role to play, but also you can trust that your vineyard management team hopefully will have a good idea of what the vineyards are doing, and working together is going to be absolute must. And if you want to learn more, I do have a 10-week vineyard management course that I make available to the industry as an online workshop, basically two days a week for 10 weeks in spring. So if you're interested in that, you can check out my website or the Oregon State University Extension website. It's listed there, and registration is currently open. So thank you for this opportunity to present, and I'll be addressing questions all during my presentation.